Hello and welcome. I am so glad you have found your way here to Sleep Tales. Tonight, we have a very special story for you. A story about light and shadows, about memory and healing. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let your body grow heavy and your mind become still. If you enjoy our journey together, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and commenting to let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. It is always a comfort to know where our stories are traveling. Now let your breath slow down, close your eyes, and let us begin. The village of Etheria was a secret kept by the mountains. It rested in a high valley, a cup held in the stone hands of the peaks. Life here was simple and quiet, governed not by the sun and moon alone, but by the great Sunstones. These were not mere crystals. They were the heart of the village. The largest stood in the center of the main square, the Great Sunstone, taller than 2 men and wide enough for 10 children to link hands around. Many smaller stones were set along the pathways and above the doors of the stone and wood houses. During the day, they drank in the sunlight, absorbing its warmth and brightness. When dusk fell and the sky turned to deep purple and black, the stones would begin to release the light they had saved. It was not a harsh light, but a warm, golden glow that filled every corner of Etheria. This light kept the brutal mountain cold at bay. It helped the special night-blooming flowers to open their petals. It made the village a safe and peaceful place, a pocket of eternal gentle daylight held within the deep, dark night of the high mountains. In this village lived a young woman named Kaia. She was 21 years old, with quiet hands and eyes that held the deep gray of the mountain stone. She was a Sunstone Polisher, a job of great importance. It was her duty, and the duty of the other polishers, to care for the stones. Every day, they would clean and polish the surfaces of the great crystals using fine sands and soft cloths. This work kept the stones clear, allowing them to absorb the sun's light to their fullest. Kaia was good at her job. Her movements were precise and steady. She could work for hours, her mind focused only on the smooth surface beneath her hands, on the rhythmic motion of polishing. She was quiet and kept to herself, a solitary figure in a village of close families. Her quietness was a shield for a deep and constant pain. 5 years ago, her mother, Alara, had died. Alara had not just been a polisher. She had been the best, the most skilled and intuitive caretaker of the stones that Etheria had ever known. She understood them in a way no one else did. She used to say she could feel their moods, that she could hear them hum with contentment after a good polishing. Alara had died while tending to the Spire Stone, the highest and most remote of all the Sunstones, perched on a dangerous peak that watched over the village. The elders said she had slipped, a tragic accident on the treacherous path. For Kaia, the world had lost its warmth that day. She continued her work as a polisher because it was all she knew, and it connected her to her mother. But she never worked on the higher stones. She stayed in the safety of the village, her focus only on the familiar surfaces of the lower stones, her heart carefully guarded against the memory of the fall, the memory of the silence that followed. She polished away the dust from the stones, but she could never polish away the sorrow that had settled deep within her. And then, a change began. It was subtle at first, a thing you might not notice if you were not paying attention. But Kaia noticed. She spent all her time with the stones, and she knew them. The golden light from the great sunstone in the village square seemed a little less golden. It had a thinner quality, a paleness at its edges. And deep within the stone, a place no polishing cloth could ever reach, a small shadow began to form. It was no bigger than a fist, a smudge of cold gray in the crystal's warm heart. It was a flaw, a stain, a tiny seed of darkness planted in the very center of Etheria's light. Kaia tried to ignore it, to tell herself it was a trick of the eye. But every day, when she placed her hands on the stone to begin her work, she could feel a faint, unfamiliar coldness spreading from that spot. The stone, which had always felt like a living, warm thing, now had a touch of winter in its core. Chapter 1. A Deepening Twilight. The change in the Great Sunstone did not remain a secret for long. What had started as a subtle paleness that only Kaia noticed soon became a topic of worried whispers throughout Etheria. The warm, golden light that had bathed the village in a gentle glow for centuries was now noticeably weaker. It was a watery yellow light, like sunlight seen through a dusty window. The nights, once just as bright and safe as the day, grew colder. Families began to use more wood in their fireplaces, the scent of smoke hanging heavier in the mountain air. The weavers who worked at their looms in the evenings had to light precious candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows that made their small workshops feel strange and unfamiliar. Even the bakers noticed a difference. Their bread dough, which always rose perfectly in the steady, gentle warmth of the kitchens, was now sluggish and heavy. Everything in the village seemed to be slowing down, growing colder, succumbing to a strange and weary sadness. The deepest change was in the feeling of the village itself. The children, who used to play hide and seek among the glowing stones long after the sun had set, now hurried home at dusk. Their laughter, once the most common sound in the evenings, was replaced by a nervous quiet. They spoke of new shadows in the alleyways, shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. The glowing moss that grew along the edges of the main paths, a soft green carpet that drank in the Sunstone's light, began to fade. Its gentle luminescence was now a dull, patchy glow, making the paths harder to see, more treacherous in the growing dimness. The night-blooming flowers, the pride of the village, were suffering the most. The sun petals, whose wide white blossoms would open each evening to face the great sunstone, now remained tightly shut, their heads bowed as if in mourning. The air, which usually carried their sweet fragrance through the night, was now just cold and empty. Etheria was losing its light, and with it, the village was losing its spirit. The village elders, seeing the growing fear among their people, decided they had to act. They called a meeting in the Great Hall, a large stone building whose walls were lined with small, embedded sunstones that now offered only the weakest of light. The hall was crowded. Every family was there, their faces filled with anxiety, their voices a low hum of worry. Elder Boren stood before them. He was a tall man with a stern face and hair as white as the winter snow. He believed in tradition, in the old ways. He saw the world in simple terms of right and wrong, of clean and unclean. He placed his hands on the stone lectern and waited for silence. He told the villagers that there was no need for fear. He said the stone was not sick or cursed. It was simply dirty. He explained that a long and dusty summer had left a film on the stone that was blocking its ability to absorb the sun. The shadow inside, he declared, was just that, a shadow. A trick of the light caused by the surface being unclean. His solution was simple and direct. The polishers had to work harder. They needed to double their efforts, to scrub the stone with more force, to use the coarsest sands to remove this stubborn film. His voice was loud and confident, and the villagers, who were desperate for a simple answer, wanted to believe him. They nodded their heads and murmured their agreement. He was an elder. He was supposed to know these things. Kaia stood at the back of the hall, her heart heavy. She knew he was wrong. She had spent every day for weeks working on the Great Sunstone. Its surface was perfectly clean, as smooth as glass. The problem was not on the outside, it was deep within. After the meeting, while the other villagers returned to their homes with a small, fragile sense of hope, Kaia went to the village square. The great sunstone stood there, looking tired and sad under the faint starlight. The shadow inside seemed larger tonight, darker. She placed her hands on its surface. The coldness was stronger now. It was not just a lack of warmth. It was an active, seeping cold that felt deeply, profoundly sad. As she held her hands there, she felt a wave of sorrow wash over her, a grief so immense that it almost brought her to her knees. It was not her own grief, it was something else. It felt ancient and vast, the collected sadness of 100 lifetimes. She knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that Elderborn's plan would not work. You could not scrub away a feeling. You could not polish away a memory. The next days were filled with frantic activity. Following Elderborn's orders, the polishers worked from sunrise to sunset. They used the harshest polishing sands, their hands growing raw from the effort. Kaia worked alongside them, her movements mechanical, her mind filled with dread. The villagers would gather to watch, their faces hopeful, waiting for the golden light to return. But it did not. In fact, things grew worse. The constant, aggressive scrubbing seemed to be hurting the stone. Small, hairline cracks, almost invisible to the naked eye, began to appear on its surface. And the light, instead of growing brighter, became even dimmer, the sickly yellow color deepening. The shadow inside did not shrink. It expanded, uncurling like a sleeping animal waking from a long slumber. It was no longer a small smudge. It now filled nearly a quarter of the stone's core, a swirling mass of cold darkness. The atmosphere in the village soured. The fragile hope that Elderborn had inspired turned into frustration and then into fear. The children stopped going out to play altogether, staying inside their homes, close to the fire. The wilting flowers began to lose their petals, which lay like pale snow on the cold ground. The once bright moss on the pathways turned to a dull, lifeless brown. The failure of the elders' plan left a vacuum, and that vacuum was quickly filled with darker thoughts. Whispers of a curse began again, louder this time. Neighbors who had been friends for a lifetime began to look at each other with suspicion. Old arguments were remembered. Small jealousies were magnified. The deepening twilight outside was creating a darkness inside the hearts of the villagers as well. Kaia felt this darkness more than anyone. The sadness she felt from the stone was a constant weight on her spirit. It followed her home from her work. It sat with her during her simple meals. It haunted her dreams. She would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling of immense loss, her cheeks wet with tears she did not remember crying. She started to see shadows in her own small home, fleeting movements in the corners of her eyes. She felt utterly alone, trapped between the stubborn blindness of the elders and a growing, sorrowful darkness that only she seemed to truly feel. The great Sunstone was not just a rock. It was the heart of her village, and she knew, with a terrifying and lonely certainty, that its heart was breaking. Chapter 2. Her mother's tools. The days that followed were a blur of useless hard work. Kaia rose before the sun, her body aching before she even began. She walked through the cold, gray streets of Etheria to the village square. The great Sunstone stood there like a monument to their failure, its light growing weaker with each passing day. The shadow inside was now a great, dark cloud that had swallowed nearly half of the crystal's heart. The air around it was palpably cold, a pocket of deep winter in the middle of the village. she and the other polishers would spend the entire day scrubbing its surface. They worked in a grim silence, the rhythmic scrape of sand on stone the only sound in the square. The work was pointless. They were all just scratching at the surface of a problem that lay far too deep to reach. Her hands were rubbed raw, the skin cracked and bleeding from the coarse sand and the biting cold. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the deep, aching frustration in her soul. When the sun finally set behind the jagged peaks, plunging the world into darkness, the polishers would gather their tools and walk home. Their shoulders were slumped in defeat. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The walk home was the hardest part of the day for Kaia. She would pass the houses of her neighbors, their windows dark except for the small, flickering light of a single candle or the weak glow of a tiny personal sunstone above their door. These smaller stones were also beginning to fail now, their light fading in sympathy with the great sunstone. The village was being slowly starved of its light. The pathways were treacherous and dark, the once familiar route to her own home now filled with uncertain shadows. She saw no one. The villagers stayed inside, locked away with their growing fear. Etheria, once a place of community and warmth, had become a village of strangers hiding from the dark. Her own small house felt the coldest of all. It stood at the edge of the village, a little more isolated than the others. The small sunstone above her door, a gift from her mother long ago, now gave off a light no brighter than a dying ember. Inside, a deep chill had settled into the stone walls. She would light a fire, but its warmth seemed to be swallowed by the cold air before it could reach the corners of the room. She would sit by the fire, eating her simple meal of bread and cheese, and stare into the flames. Her mind was a whirlpool of helpless thoughts. She saw Elder Boren's stern, unyielding face. She heard the frightened whispers of the other villagers, and she felt the immense, silent sadness of the great sunstone, a feeling that had seeped into her own bones. She felt trapped. The only solution the elders had was to work harder, a solution that was clearly making things worse. She had tried to speak, to suggest that the problem was not on the surface, but she had been dismissed. She was too young. What could she know? The weight of her helplessness was a heavy blanket, threatening to smother the small spark of hope she had left. One night, sitting in the cold silence of her home, she looked at the mantelpiece above her fireplace. On it sat a small carved wooden bird, a thing her mother had made for her when she was a child. Its simple form was so familiar, so filled with love. Looking at it, a thought sparked in her mind. The elders were lost. The old traditions were failing them. There was no one in the village who had a new idea. But her mother, Alara, had always had new ideas. She had looked at the world differently. She saw patterns no one else saw. She understood the stones in a way that felt more like a friendship than a job. If anyone could have understood what was happening, it would have been her. The thought was painful. It brought a fresh wave of grief, a sharp reminder of her absence. But beneath the grief was another feeling, a tiny flicker of purpose. Her mother was gone, but her mother's things were not. Her knowledge, her ideas, they might still exist, hidden somewhere in this very house. The decision to search through her mother's belongings was not an easy one. In the 5 years since Alara's death, Kaia had carefully preserved her mother's room exactly as she had left it. She would clean it, dust the furniture, but she never moved anything. She never opened a drawer. She never looked inside the chests. That room was a shrine to her memory, and to disturb it felt wrong. It also felt terrifying. To touch her mother's things would be to feel her absence all over again, to face the full force of a grief she had tried so hard to keep contained. For a long time, she sat by the fire, wrestling with this fear. The fear of that pain was immense, but the fear of the growing darkness outside, of her village slowly dying, was greater. The cold from the failing stones was a more immediate threat than the cold of her old sorrow. With a deep breath that shuddered in her chest, she stood up. She knew what she had to do. She walked to the back of her small house, to a storage room she rarely entered. The air inside was still and cool, thick with the scent of dried herbs and old wood. Faint light from the dying fire in the main room filtered through the doorway, casting long, soft shadows. The room was filled with the quiet history of her family. There were stacks of woven blankets, their colors faded with time. There were clay pots and jars her mother had made, their surfaces smooth and cool to the touch. In one corner stood her mother's old spinning wheel, silent and draped in a thin veil of dust, a spider web connecting its spindle to the wall. Everything in this room held a memory, a piece of the life that had been stolen from her. She began her search slowly, carefully. She lifted the lid of a large wooden chest. Inside were her mother's winter cloaks. As she lifted one, a heavy, dark blue cloak, the faint scent of pine needles and mountain air rose from the wool. It was her mother's scent. Kaia closed her eyes, pressing the fabric to her face. And for a moment, it was as if her mother was standing right there beside her. A tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, warm against her cold skin. She gently folded the cloak and placed it back in the chest, closing the lid with a soft thud. She moved through the room with a tender reverence. She found a small box filled with beautiful, smooth stones from the river. She found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, letters from her grandmother who lived in a village on the other side of the mountains. Each object was a small story, a whisper from the past. It was painful, more painful than she had imagined. But with the pain, there was also a sense of connection, a feeling that she was not as alone as she had thought. Her mother's spirit was here, in these simple, treasured things. After what felt like hours, she finally saw it, pushed back into the darkest corner of the room. It was her mother's tool chest. It was different from the simple leather bags the other polishers used. This chest was a work of art in itself. It was made of a dark, heavy wood, polished smooth by years of use. The metal hinges and clasps were sturdy and clean. On the lid, her mother had carved a beautiful, intricate pattern of a sunstone with rays of light spreading out from its center. This chest was the heart of her mother's work. It held the tools she had used to care for the stones of Etheria, the tools she had held in her hands every single day. Kaia felt a tremor of fear. To open this chest would be to touch the very center of her mother's life, and the center of her own loss. This was the chest that held the tools she had taken with her on that final, fatal climb to the Spire Stone. For a long time, Kaia just stood there, looking at it. Her hand hovered over the lid, afraid to touch it. She remembered her mother sitting on the floor, the chest open in front of her, carefully cleaning each tool after a long day's work. She remembered the gentle, focused look on her mother's face, the love she had for her craft. The memory gave her strength. She knelt down on the cold stone floor and placed her hands on the smooth, carved wood. She took a deep breath and lifted the heavy lid. The hinges made a soft groaning sound, the only sound in the silent room. The inside of the chest was just as she remembered it. It was a perfect picture of order and care. On the top tray, nestled in soft leather pockets, were the polishing cloths. There were dozens of them, in different sizes and textures, from rough, burlap-like squares for the initial cleaning to pieces of the softest, finest wool for the final polish. Beneath the tray were the jars of polishing sands. There were sands of different colors and coarseness, each one labeled in her mother's neat, elegant handwriting. There were jars of special oils that her mother mixed herself, oils that protected the stones from the harshest winter winds. And there were the specialized tools, small brushes made from animal hair for cleaning tiny crevices, and delicate metal picks for removing stubborn lichen. It was the collection of a true master, someone who knew that caring for the stones was not just work, but an art. Kaia ran her fingers over the familiar objects, a fresh wave of sadness and admiration washing over her. She lifted the main tray of tools out of the chest, intending to look for anything unusual, any clue, though she did not know what she was looking for. As she set the tray down on the floor beside her, she noticed something odd. The wooden bottom of the chest was not a single solid piece. There was a faint line in the wood that suggested a separate panel. It was almost perfectly fitted, nearly invisible. Her curiosity grew. She ran her fingers along the line and felt a small, almost unnoticeable indentation at one edge. She pressed it. There was a soft click, and the panel of wood lifted ever so slightly. It was a false bottom. Her heart began to beat faster. This was a secret, a place for things meant to be hidden. With trembling fingers, she lifted the wooden panel. The space underneath was not deep, only a few inches, and nestled inside, lying on a piece of dark, soft velvet, was a single object. It was a book. It was bound in dark brown leather, worn smooth at the edges and corners from years of handling. It was not a large book, but it felt heavy and important in her hands. A simple leather cord was wrapped around it, holding it shut. Kaia felt a shiver run through her. This was it. This was what she had been looking for, without even knowing it. She carefully unwound the leather cord and opened the book. The first page was filled with her mother's handwriting. It was as clear and beautiful as she remembered. Kaia moved closer to the doorway, letting the weak, flickering light from the fire fall upon the page. She began to read. The first several entries were comforting in their familiarity. They were notes about her work. Her mother wrote about the different qualities of the sunstones in the village. The stone near the baker's shop, she wrote, was always the warmest, seeming to hold the heat from the ovens. The stone near the stream at the edge of the village had a clearer, brighter light, as if it had absorbed the clarity of the water. She detailed different polishing techniques, noting how the changing seasons affected the stone's surfaces. She wrote about a new mixture of sand and oil she had created that worked especially well after a heavy rain. Reading these pages felt like having a quiet conversation with her mother. It was like listening to her share the secrets of her craft. Kaia read for what must have been an hour, completely absorbed, a small, sad smile on her face. It was a relief to be in the presence of her mother's calm, practical wisdom. Then, the tone of the journal began to change. The entries became less about the physical work of polishing and more about her mother's thoughts and feelings about the stones. The neat, practical notes gave way to more searching, more philosophical questions. One entry read, "Today, as I polished the stone in the main square, I felt a deep hum of joy from within it. The whole village was celebrating the harvest, and their laughter filled the air. I am becoming more and more certain that the stones do not just hold sunlight. They hold our feelings too." Kaia stopped reading for a moment, her brow furrowed. This was a strange thought, one she had never heard anyone in the village express before. She read on. The entries continued in this new direction. Her mother wrote about feeling a wave of peace from the stone near the quiet garden where the old people sat in the afternoons. She described feeling a flutter of nervous excitement from the stone outside the great hall on the day of a wedding. She had given this connection a name. She called the stones the heartbeats of the mountain. She wrote, "They are not just our light. They are our listeners. They absorb our joy, our peace, our excitement. They are a mirror to the village's soul." Kaia felt a chill run down her spine. This was not the talk of a simple polisher. This was the thinking of someone who saw a deeper magic in the world, a connection between the people and the very rock of their mountain home. Then, Kaia turned a page and found the entry that changed everything. The handwriting on this page was a little less neat, a little more hurried, as if her mother had been writing with a great sense of urgency. "A shadow has appeared," the entry began. "A small one, in the heart of the great Sunstone. The elders do not remember, but I have read the old scrolls. It happened once before, long ago, after the long winter." Kaia's breath caught in her throat. The long winter was a story the grandparents told, a terrible time, decades ago, when a blight had ruined the crops and a sickness had swept through Etheria, taking many lives. It was a time of great sorrow and hardship for the village. Her mother's entry continued, describing how the scrolls told of a shadow appearing in the stone during that dark time. The elders back then had done the same thing Elderborn was doing now. They had ordered the polishers to scrub the stone to try and banish the darkness. But it had not worked. The shadow had only grown, and the light had almost gone out completely. It was only when spring finally came, and with it, new life and new hope, that the shadow had slowly, over many months, begun to fade. The final paragraph of the entry made Kaia's hands tremble. Alara had written her own conclusion, her own theory, in bold, clear letters. They were wrong then, and I fear our elders would be wrong now. The stone did not catch a sickness from the village. It was holding our sorrow. It was grieving with us. The shadow was not a stain to be removed, but a wound to be healed. It was the physical form of our collective heartbreak. Kaia sat there on the cold floor of the dusty storage room, the open journal resting in her lap. The last embers of the fire in the other room had died, and the house was now completely dark and cold. But she did not notice. Her mind was ablaze. An answer. She finally had an answer. It was a terrifying answer, an idea so different from everything she had ever been taught. The shadow was not a curse. It was not dirt. It was grief. It was the village's own sadness stored in the heart of the stone, and the frantic, aggressive scrubbing was not cleaning it. It was like scrubbing at a deep wound, only making it worse. She finally understood the profound sadness she felt whenever she touched the stone. She was feeling the collected pain of her entire village. She held her mother's journal to her chest, the worn leather a small comfort in the vast, overwhelming darkness. She finally had the truth, but it was a truth that would set her against everyone she knew. Chapter 3. The Elder's Decree. The cold was the first thing Kaia felt each morning. It was a new kind of cold, a deep and penetrating cold that seemed to come from the stones of her house, from the very earth beneath the floor. It was a damp, lifeless cold that the fire in her hearth could not push away. She would wake up shivering under a mountain of blankets, her breath a white cloud in the air of her own room. The weak, dying light from the small sunstone above her door did nothing to warm the space. It cast a pale, ghostly glow that made the familiar shapes of her furniture seem strange and menacing. Getting out of bed was an act of will, a choice to face another day of failure and encroaching darkness. The situation in Etheria was no longer just a worry. It had become a slow, creeping disaster. The great sunstone in the village square was now almost entirely dark. The warm, golden heart was gone, consumed by the swirling, silent storm of shadow within. Only a thin, fragile rind of pale yellow light remained around its outer edge, a light so weak it seemed to struggle for its very existence. The effect on the village was devastating. The days were shorter now, as the mountains blocked the sun earlier in the afternoon, and without the stones to hold the light, the transition to night was swift and absolute. A deep, profound darkness fell over Etheria each evening, a blackness that felt heavy and suffocating. It was a darkness that swallowed sound, that muffled footsteps, that made the world feel small and dangerous. The cold that came with the darkness was relentless. The stored warmth of the stones was gone. The nights were now filled with the biting frost of the high peaks. The villagers' stores of firewood, usually more than enough to last through a winter, were dwindling at an alarming rate. People stayed in one room of their homes, huddled together around their fires, trying to conserve both wood and warmth. The pipes that carried water from the mountain spring began to freeze, and each morning men had to take pickaxes to break the ice so the village could have water. The night-blooming flowers had all died, their stalks black and brittle, their frozen petals scattered like dust on the ground. The glowing moss was completely gone, leaving the pathways in treacherous darkness. To walk through the village at night was to risk a fall on the uneven stones, to become lost in a familiar place that had become alien and hostile. The lack of light and warmth began to take a toll on the people themselves. A persistent, hacking cough spread through the village, a sickness that seemed to thrive in the damp and the cold. The old people especially suffered. They had no energy, and they spent their days and nights in their beds, their faces pale and drawn. The children, robbed of their evening play, grew listless and pale. They were always tired. They did not laugh. They cried often, a thin, whimpering sound that was a constant, heartbreaking background noise in the quiet, cold houses. The village healer did her best, brewing hot teas from her dwindling supply of herbs, but she could not heal a sickness that was born of darkness and despair. This despair was the most dangerous change of all. The initial hope that Elder Boren had inspired was now a bitter memory. The days of working together to scrub the stone were over. The polishers still worked, but it was a joyless, mechanical task, and they knew it was useless. The failure of their efforts had left a void, and into that void crept suspicion and blame. The close-knit community of Etheria, a village where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived side by side for generations, began to fracture. The fear, with no clear enemy to focus on, turned inward. Kaia saw it happening all around her. The whispers started first. She would see small groups of people huddled together in the dim light of the square, their heads close, their voices low. They would fall silent when she or one of the other polishers walked by. They were looking for someone to blame. An old woman who lived on her own and talked to the birds was now called a witch. People said she had cast a curse on the stone. Children would throw rocks at her door. A family of newcomers who had moved to the village a year ago were now treated like outsiders, their presence seen as a bad omen. People would turn their backs when they entered the baker's shop. Old grudges, long forgotten, were unearthed. A dispute over a piece of land from 20 years ago was spoken of as the cause of the darkness. Two brothers who had argued over an inheritance stopped speaking to each other. The darkness outside was feeding a darkness inside the people. Their hearts were growing as cold as the stones. Kaia felt like a ghost in her own village. She performed her duties at the great Sunstone, the gritty sound of sand on its surface, a constant reminder of their failure. The immense sadness she felt from the stone was a part of her now, a permanent weight in her chest. But now it was mixed with the sadness she felt for her people. She saw the fear in their eyes, the way they looked at each other with distrust. She heard the bitter, angry words they exchanged in the street. Her mother's journal was a secret she carried inside her, a truth that felt heavier with each passing day. She knew why this was happening. She knew the shadow was not a curse, but a reflection of the village's own pain. But how could she make them understand? They were so lost in their fear that they would not be able to hear a truth so strange and different from everything they had ever known. Elder Boren seemed to age a decade in a matter of weeks. The stern confidence he had shown at the first meeting was gone. His face was now a mask of grim determination, but his eyes were filled with a deep, hunted look. He walked through the village with a stiff, rigid posture, as if the weight of his people's fear was a physical burden on his shoulders. He spent hours standing in the square, staring at the dying Sunstone, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He saw the sickness. He saw the division. He saw his village crumbling around him. His simple solution had failed, and this failure had made him not more open, but more stubborn. He could not admit that he was wrong. He could not accept that the traditions he had trusted his entire life were not enough. In his desperation, he turned not to new ideas, but to older, more dangerous ones. He searched the village archives, the scrolls that held the oldest laws and rituals, looking for a more powerful solution, a way to fight the darkness, to attack it, to banish it by force. One evening, the village crier walked through the darkening streets, his bell ringing with a heavy, solemn sound. He announced that Elder Boren had called another meeting. Attendance was mandatory for every adult in Etheria. A new feeling of dread settled over Kaia. She knew this was not a meeting to discuss new ideas. This was a meeting where a decision would be announced, an order to be followed. She held her mother's journal tightly in her hands as she made her way to the great hall. She had to be brave. She had to be ready to speak. The great hall was even colder and darker than before. The small sunstones embedded in the walls were barely glowing, giving off just enough light to see the shapes of people, their faces lost in shadow. The room was packed, but it was a different kind of crowd than the last time. There was no hopeful murmuring. The hall was filled with a tense, fearful silence. People did not look at each other. They stared straight ahead at the stone lectern where Elder Boren stood, his face a grim silhouette against the weak light. He began to speak. His voice was not loud and confident as it had been before. It was hard and brittle, like ice. He told the villagers what they already knew. He spoke of the spreading sickness, the freezing cold, the dwindling food and firewood. He spoke of the darkness that was poisoning their home. But he did not call it a stain or a layer of dust this time. He gave it a new name. He called it a curse. He called it a malevolent entity, a creature of shadow that had invaded their stone and was feeding on their light. He used words like infection and blight. He was giving their fear a face, a name, something they could hate, something they could fight. Then he told them of his plan. He said he had found a description of an ancient ritual in the oldest scrolls, a ritual of banishment. The ritual was designed to destroy a darkness that had taken root in a sunstone. It was a dangerous ritual, one that had not been performed in centuries. But, he said, these were desperate times. The plan was to use a rare and powerful crystal, a sun shard, which was kept in a locked chest in the archives. This shard had a unique property. It could take the pure, undiluted light of the morning sun and focus it into a single, intensely powerful beam. The plan was to place the shard on a pedestal in front of the great sunstone. At the precise moment of sunrise, the beam it created would strike the heart of the stone, where the shadow was deepest. Boren used the word shatter. He said the beam of pure light would shatter the darkness, break it into 1,000,000 pieces, and banish it from their stone forever. A gasp went through the crowd. The plan was violent, aggressive. It sounded dangerous, but it was also a plan of action. It was a fight. It was a way to strike back at the darkness that was destroying their lives. In their desperation, the idea of a powerful, immediate solution was a powerful lure. A murmur of agreement began to spread through the hall. They were tired of being cold and scared. They wanted to fight. Kaia stood at the back, her mother's journal clutched in her hands, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Everything inside her screamed in protest. Shatter the darkness? Her mother's words echoed in her mind. The shadow was not an enemy. It was a wound. It was their own sorrow. To strike it with a beam of pure light would be like stabbing a grieving heart. It would not heal the stone. It would destroy it. She imagined the great sunstone cracking under the force of the blow, its last fragile light extinguished forever, leaving them in a permanent cold darkness. She had to speak. The thought terrified her. She was not a speaker. She was a quiet worker. All her life, she had kept her head down, done her work, and avoided attention. To stand up now, to speak against an elder in front of the entire village, seemed impossible. Her throat felt tight and dry. Her legs felt weak. She could just stay silent. She could let them make this terrible mistake. No one would blame her. But then she thought of her mother, of the courage it must have taken for her to write down those forbidden ideas, to seek a new truth. She thought of the sick children, of the fearful old people, of the beautiful village that was dying around her. Her fear for them was greater than her fear for herself. Before she could change her mind, she began to walk. She moved from the back of the hall, down the central aisle, toward the stone lectern. People turned to look at her, their faces surprised, some annoyed. She was just a young polisher. What could she possibly have to say? She kept her eyes fixed on Elder Boren. When she reached the front of the hall, she stopped. She did not know what to say, how to begin. She held up the leather-bound journal. Her hand was shaking. "This was my mother's," she said. Her voice was small and trembling at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. She was studying the stones. She wrote down her thoughts. Elder Boren looked down at her, his expression cold and impatient. He did not like being interrupted. "Your mother was a fine polisher, Kaia," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "But this is a time for the wisdom of the elders, not for old notes." "But she knew," Kaia insisted, her voice gaining urgency. "She wrote about the long winter. She said a shadow appeared then, too. They tried to fight it, but it only made things worse." She opened the journal, her trembling fingers finding the page. She wrote that the shadow is not a curse. It is the village's own sorrow. The stone is grieving with us. It holds our pain. To attack it will not heal it. It will break it. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, their features barely visible in the gloom. She saw confusion, disbelief, and a few glimmers of curiosity, but mostly she saw fear. They were too scared to believe in an idea so strange, so gentle. It was easier to believe in an enemy you could fight than in a wound you had to heal. Elder Boren let out a short, harsh laugh. It was not a sound of humor, but of dismissal. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Kaia," he said, his voice now soft and patronizing, the way one speaks to a foolish child. "We all honor your mother's memory, and we all understand your grief. It is a terrible thing to lose a mother, but your sorrow is clouding your mind. You are seeing stories and fantasies where there is only a simple truth. There is a darkness in our stone, and we must cut it out. These are the fancies of a grieving daughter, not the wisdom we need to save our village." He turned back to the crowd, his hand still on her shoulder, effectively ending the conversation. "The ritual will take place in 2 days at sunrise," he announced, his voice booming with renewed authority. "Prepare yourselves, we will take back our light." A cheer went up from the crowd. It was a ragged, desperate sound, but it was a cheer nonetheless. They had a plan. They had a leader. They had an enemy to destroy. No one looked at Kaia as she turned and walked away. She was dismissed, forgotten. She made her way out of the great hall and back into the cold, dark street. The sound of the cheering behind her like a physical blow. She had spoken the truth. She had offered them her mother's wisdom, and they had rejected it. They had chosen a path of violence, a path that she knew, with every fiber of her being, would lead to their ruin. She was completely and utterly alone. Her village was marching toward a cliff, and she was the only one who could see it. Chapter 4: The Unfinished Work. The walk back to her small house was the loneliest journey of Kaia's life. The darkness of the village streets was absolute, a thick, tangible blackness that seemed to press in on her from all sides. The few villagers she passed on their way home from the great hall were just shapeless forms in the gloom. They did not speak to her. They did not even look at her. They moved past her as if she were a ghost, their faces set and grim, full of the false hope Elder Boren had given them. The sound of their footsteps on the cold stone was the only sound, a hollow, rhythmic beat that echoed the pounding of her own heart. The cheer that had erupted in the hall still rang in her ears, a harsh, ugly sound that had sealed the fate of her village. They had chosen anger over understanding. They had chosen a weapon over a remedy. When she reached her own home, the small, dying sunstone above her door looked like a sad, weeping eye. She pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The cold that greeted her was no longer just a physical sensation. It was the cold of utter isolation. She was an outcast in her own home, a voice of truth that no one wanted to hear. She did not light a fire. She did not light a candle. She felt more comfortable in the darkness. It matched the feeling inside her heart. She sank into a wooden chair at her small table, the worn leather journal still clutched in her hands. The silence of the house was immense. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a tomb, the silence of a future that had been decided without her. For a long time, she just sat there, motionless in the dark. Her mind was a storm of thoughts and feelings. She felt a deep, biting anger at Elder Boren, at his pride and his stubborn refusal to listen. She felt a profound sorrow for her village, for her neighbors who were so lost in their fear that they would cling to a violent, dangerous plan. And underneath it all, she felt a terrible, crushing weight of failure. She had tried to help them. She had offered them her mother's wisdom, a new path, a gentler way, and they had laughed at her. They had called her a foolish, grieving child. The words stung more than any physical blow. They had not just dismissed her idea, they had dismissed her, and they had dismissed her mother's memory. Her gaze fell upon the journal in her hands. It was the only thing in the world that made sense right now. It was her only connection to a truth that felt real and solid in a world that had gone mad. The worn leather felt warm from the heat of her hands, a small living comfort in the dead cold of the room. She knew she could not give up. As long as this journal existed, as long as her mother's words were here, there was still a chance, however small. She had to understand more. She had to find the rest of the story. She owed it to her mother. She owed it to the dying stone in the square. She owed it to the village, even if they did not want her help. With slow, deliberate movements, she got up and lit a single, thin candle. Its small, flickering flame pushed the deepest shadows back a few feet, creating a tiny circle of wavering light in the vast darkness of her home. She placed the candle on the table and sat down again, opening the journal. She did not go to the page she had read before. She went back to the beginning. She needed to see it all. She needed to follow her mother's journey of discovery from the very start, to see the world through her eyes, to understand how she had come to a truth so different from everyone else's. She began to read, her finger tracing the elegant lines of her mother's handwriting. The early pages were filled with the simple, beautiful details of her mother's craft. Ilara wrote about the feel of the sun on her back as she worked. She wrote about the different songs of the birds that nested in the cliffs near the higher stones. She described the satisfaction of seeing a stone's light grow warmer and brighter after a long day of polishing. It was clear from her words that this was not just a job to her. It was a calling. It was a relationship. She loved the stones, and she felt that they loved her back. Kaia read about how her mother began to notice the small things, the patterns no one else saw. She wrote about the day of a great summer festival when the entire village was happy and singing. That night, she had noticed the light from the great sunstone was brighter than ever before, a rich, vibrant gold she had never seen. And on a different day, a day when a beloved old man had passed away and a sad quiet had fallen over the village, she had noticed the stone's light was softer, more subdued, as if it were sharing in their mourning. These were the first seeds of her strange idea, the first whispers of the theory that the stones were connected to the village's heart. As Kaia read deeper into the journal, she saw her mother's ideas become stronger, more certain. Ilara had started to conduct small experiments. She would spend time near a stone and think happy thoughts, focusing on a joyful memory. She wrote that she could feel a faint, warm vibration from the stone in response. When she felt sad, she could feel a subtle coolness. The other polishers thought she was strange. They saw the stones as objects, as tools for living. Ilara saw them as living beings, as silent friends. She wrote of her frustration with the elders, with their rigid, unchanging view of the world. "They see the surface," she wrote, "but they are blind to the soul. They know how to clean the stones, but they have forgotten how to listen to them." The pages turned. The candle flame danced, casting flickering shadows on the wall. Kaia was no longer in her cold, dark house. She was with her mother on a journey of discovery. She felt her mother's excitement, her frustration, her loneliness. She was beginning to understand the immense courage it took for her mother to hold on to these beliefs in a village that valued tradition above all else. Alara had been just as alone as Kaia was now, a solitary keeper of a difficult truth. Then Kaia came to a section of the journal that was different. The handwriting was still neat, but there were more sketches, more diagrams. Her mother had started to think about the Sunstones not as individual crystals, but as a system. She had drawn a map of Etheria, marking the location of every single sunstone, from the smallest ones above the doorways to the great sunstone in the square. She drew lines connecting them like a great spider web with the village at its center. She had a new theory. She believed that all the stones were connected, that they shared their light and their feelings through invisible channels that ran through the rock of the mountain itself. She believed they were like the flowers of a single great plant whose roots ran deep into the earth. This idea led her to a new and vital question. If the stones were all connected, then there must be a center. There must be one stone that was the source, the heart from which all the others drew their life. A heart stone. She began to study the old maps of the valley, the ones kept in the archives. She spent weeks poring over them, and she found it. The oldest maps, the ones drawn by the first settlers of Etheria, showed a single massive stone on the highest peak overlooking the valley. The maps named it the Spire Stone. In the newer maps, it was still there, but it was marked simply as a landmark, its importance forgotten. The first settlers had known. They had understood that the Spire Stone was the heart, but over generations, that knowledge had been lost. It had faded into myth, and then it had been forgotten completely. This discovery filled her mother's writing with a new and powerful energy. She wrote page after page about the Spire Stone. She theorized that its connection to the other stones was the most important one. She believed that the health of the Spire Stone determined the health of the entire system. If the Heartstone was strong, all the stones would be strong. If the Heartstone was weak, all the stones would suffer. She wrote, "We spend all our time tending to the leaves, but we have forgotten the root. We polish the stones in the village, but we have left the heart of our mountain unattended for centuries." Kaia felt a shiver of understanding. This was the key. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. The problem was not in the village. It was high above, on the lonely peak. The great sunstone was not the source of the sickness. It was just showing the symptoms of a much deeper problem. She read on, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. The journal entries were now dated. She saw that they were from the weeks leading up to her mother's death. Alara wrote that she had started to feel a subtle change in the stones, a faint coolness, a slight dimming of their light that no one else could perceive. She feared that something was wrong with the Spire Stone, she felt a growing sense of urgency, a feeling that she had to do something before it was too late. She wrote of her decision. She had to go to the spire stone. She had to see it for herself. She had to tend to it, to polish it, to listen to it, to heal it if it was sick. And then, Kaia turned the page and found the final entry. The page was different from all the others. The handwriting was rushed, the letters less perfect, as if written by a hand that was shaking with emotion or cold. The ink was slightly smeared in one corner, as if a drop of water had fallen on it. The entry was dated for the morning of the day her mother died. It began with a simple, chilling sentence. "I am going now." Kaia's heart stopped. She was reading her mother's last words. The entry was short, but every word was filled with a powerful weight. Ilara wrote that she was taking her best tools, her warmest cloak, and enough food for 2 days. She was going to climb to the spire. She knew the path was dangerous. She knew the weather on the high peaks was unpredictable. But she wrote that the risk was necessary. The faint shadow she had seen in the great sunstone, a shadow no one else had noticed yet, was a warning. It was a sign that the heartstone was in pain. Then came the words that changed everything Kaia had ever believed about her own life. Her mother wrote, "The elders would not understand. They would say it is a polisher's job to clean, not to heal. They see a stain and want to scrub it away. But I know this is not a stain. It is a sorrow. I do not go to the spire stone to banish a darkness. I go to understand it. I go to comfort it. I go to offer it what little warmth and care I have. That is the only way. You cannot fight a shadow. You can only fill it with light." Kaia's breath hitched in her throat. Her vision blurred with tears. She could see her mother so clearly, sitting in this very house, in the pre-dawn darkness, writing these words by candlelight. She could feel her mother's fear, her determination, her incredible, lonely courage. Her mother's death was not an accident. It was not a simple slip on a treacherous path during a routine job. Her climb had not been routine at all. It had been a mission, a secret, desperate mission to save her village from a darkness that only she could see coming. She had died trying to heal the heart of the mountain. She had sacrificed herself for the very people who had thought she was strange, for the elders who would not listen, for the village she loved. The world seemed to tilt and spin around Kaia. The last 5 years of her life had been built on a simple, tragic story. Her mother had fallen. Now that story was shattered, replaced by a truth that was both heroic and heartbreaking. The grief she had carried for 5 years, a dull, constant ache, was transformed. It became a new and powerful thing, a mixture of profound sorrow and immense, soaring pride. Her mother was not a victim. She was a hero. And then, another realization hit her. A thought so heavy it felt like a physical blow. Her mother had written that she had seen a faint shadow beginning to form. She had died trying to heal it. And what had happened after her death? The village had been plunged into a deep and lasting grief. No one had been more consumed by that grief than Kaia herself. For 5 years, she had lived in a shadow of her own making, a shadow of loss and sorrow. Her mother's journal had said that the stones absorbed the feelings of the village. The shadow was their collective sorrow given form. The final blow, the thing that had allowed the shadow to grow from a faint whisper into a devouring darkness, was the immense, unending grief that had followed her mother's death. It was her grief. Her pain had been feeding the shadow all along. The very thing she was mourning was the thing that was destroying her home. The journal slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. The candle flame guttered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. But Kaia did not notice. A new kind of light was dawning in her mind. It was a terrible, painful, and beautiful clarity. She finally understood everything. The shadow in the stone was not just the village's pain. It was her mother's story. It was the pain of her mother's lonely struggle. It was the pain of her heroic death. And it was the pain of being forgotten. She sat in the darkness, the tears now flowing freely, washing down her face in warm streams. They were not just tears of sadness. They were tears of understanding, of release. She was not crying for the mother she had lost. She was crying for the hero she had just found. A deep calm settled over her. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. The feeling of helpless despair was gone. In their place was a quiet, unshakable certainty. She knew what she had to do. The elders were going to try to shatter the shadow. They were going to attack their own grief with a beam of angry light. They were going to desecrate her mother's memory and destroy the village in the process. She could not let that happen. Her mother had started a journey. She had walked a path of compassion and understanding, but she had not been able to finish it. Now it was up to Kaia. She had to finish her mother's work. She had to climb the mountain. She had to go to the spire stone. She would not go to fight. She would go to listen. She would go to comfort. She would complete the mission that had cost her mother her life. The path that had led to her deepest trauma was now the only path that could lead to her village's salvation. And her own. Chapter 5. The Climb. The decision, once made, settled in Kaia's soul with the weight and solidity of a mountain stone. There was no more room for doubt, no space for fear. There was only the quiet, clear certainty of her purpose. She would climb to the spire stone. She would finish her mother's work. The night was still deep and absolute, a few hours of darkness still remaining before the dawn would bring the dreadful ritual of banishment. This was the only time she had. She had to move now while the village slept, lost in its fearful dreams. She did not light another candle. She moved through the familiar darkness of her home with a new confidence, her hands finding what they needed without the aid of sight. She went first to the kitchen and packed a small, sturdy bag with food. She took 2 loaves of dense, dark bread, a hard block of cheese, and a small bag of dried apples. It was simple, practical food, the kind of food that could sustain a person on a long and difficult journey. She filled a water skin from the barrel by the door, the sound of the splashing water loud in the silent house. Then she went to the storage room. She did not hesitate this time. She walked directly to her mother's tool chest. She did not take all the tools. She took only the most important ones, the ones her mother had treasured most. She took a set of the softest polishing cloths, made from the wool of the high mountain sheep, so fine they felt like silk, against the skin. She took a small clay jar of a special polishing paste her mother had made from crushed river pearls and mountain herbs. Her mother had written in the journal that this paste was not for cleaning, but for soothing, for bringing a sense of peace to a troubled stone. Finally, she took the journal itself. She wrapped it carefully in a piece of oilcloth to protect it from the weather and placed it in the very bottom of her bag, where it would be safe. These were her weapons, not of war, but of healing. They were tools of compassion, of understanding. Her final preparation was the most difficult. She went to the large wooden chest that held her mother's winter cloaks. She lifted the lid and took out the heavy, dark blue cloak, the one that still held the faint, lingering scent of pine needles and mountain air. For a moment, she held it to her face, breathing in the memory of her mother, a silent goodbye and a silent promise. Then she swung the heavy cloak over her own shoulders. The wool was thick and warm, a comforting weight. It felt like an embrace, a shield against the cold and the fear that she knew would come. Dressed in her mother's cloak, carrying her mother's tools, she was no longer just Kaia, the grieving daughter. She was Kaia, the keeper of her mother's legacy, the finisher of her mother's work. Before she left, she did one last thing. She took a small piece of parchment and a nub of charcoal and wrote a simple note. She did not write of her plan, of the spire stone, or of her mother's journal. They would not understand. They would only try to stop her. She wrote only 3 words: "I will try." She left the note on the wooden table, a small, quiet testament to her purpose. Then she slipped out of her house, closing the door softly behind her. The village of Etheria was asleep, unaware that its only chance for salvation was now walking out into the deep, cold darkness of the mountains. The path began at the very edge of the village, a narrow, winding track that was barely visible in the starless night. This was the path the polishers used to reach the lower stones, the ones set into the cliffs just above the village. Kaia knew this part of the path well. She could have walked it with her eyes closed, but tonight it felt different. The familiar twists and turns were strange and menacing in the absolute darkness. The silence of the mountain was immense. There was no wind, no sound of animals, only the crunch of her own boots on the gravel and the soft sound of her own breathing. Every snapping twig, every dislodged pebble sounded as loud as a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. She felt a profound sense of being alone, a tiny, warm creature in a vast, cold, and indifferent world of rock and shadow. After an hour of steady walking, she had left the familiar parts of the path behind. She was now in the territory of the higher stones, a place she had avoided for 5 long years. The path grew steeper and more treacherous. It was no longer a well-worn track, but a series of rough-hewn steps carved into the rock face, with a steep, dark drop on one side. She had to slow her pace, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. Her legs began to ache from the constant upward strain. Her lungs burned from the thin, cold air. The heavy cloak, which had felt like a comfort at first, now felt like a leaden weight pulling her backward, trying to drag her down. This was the beginning of her real test. The physical challenge of the climb was immense, but the emotional challenge was far greater. With every step upward, she was moving closer to the place of her deepest pain, the place where her mother had fallen. The memories she had suppressed for so long began to rise up, unbidden and sharp. She saw her mother's smiling face. She heard her mother's laugh. She remembered the warmth of her hand. These memories were beautiful, but they were also a kind of torture. They were ghosts that walked beside her on the dark path, reminders of everything she had lost. Doubt, a cold and insidious serpent, began to whisper in her mind. Who was she to be doing this? She was not a hero. She was just a girl. She was not a master polisher like her mother. She was just an apprentice. What if her mother had been wrong? What if the journal was just the product of a lonely woman's imagination? What if Elder Bourne was right? What if she was just a foolish, grieving child, chasing a fantasy up a dangerous mountain in the middle of the night? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She stumbled, her foot slipping on a patch of loose rock. She caught herself just in time, her hands scraping against the rough cliff face, her heart hammering in her chest. She leaned against the cold stone, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The urge to turn back was overwhelming. She could go back to the village. She could hide in her house. She could let the ritual happen. It would not be her fault. But then, as she stood there, trembling in the darkness, she thought of the dying stone in the square. She thought of the sick children and the frightened old people. She thought of the hateful, suspicious glances her neighbors were now giving each other. And she thought of her mother, alone on this very path, facing these same fears, but continuing onward, driven by her love for the village. Her mother had not given up. Kaia could not give up either. She closed her eyes and took a deep, slow breath, the cold air searing her lungs. She pushed the doubt away. She forced the whispering voices into silence. Her purpose was clearer than her fear. She had to keep going, one step at a time. That was all she had to do. Just one more step. She pushed herself away from the rock and continued her climb. She moved more slowly now. Her focus narrowed to the few feet of path in front of her. Her world became very small. It was just the rock under her boots, the feel of the cold stone under her questing fingers, the sound of her own steady breath. She stopped thinking about the top of the mountain. She stopped thinking about the village below. She thought only about the next step, and then the next, and then the next. The climb became a kind of meditation, a slow and difficult rhythm of movement and breath. She was no longer fighting the mountain. She was becoming a part of it, a slow, determined creature moving across its vast, silent face. The darkness began to soften. The absolute black gave way to a deep, bruised purple, and then to a soft, pearly gray. The stars faded. The eastern sky began to glow with the first faint promise of dawn. The coming of the light was both a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing because she could finally see the path clearly. She could see the handholds, the safe places to put her feet. But it was a curse because it was a reminder that her time was running out. Down in the village, the people would be waking up. They would be gathering in the square. Elder Boren would be preparing the sun shard. The ritual was coming. The light that gave her sight also brought a new and terrible urgency to her journey. The rising sun revealed the true nature of the landscape she was in. She was high above the valley now, on a narrow ledge that seemed to be pasted onto the side of a sheer cliff. The world had fallen away beneath her. Far, far below, she could see Etheria. It was a collection of tiny gray shapes, a toy village nestled in the deep shadows of the valley. She could see the square, a tiny open space. She could see a dark shape in its center, the dying great sunstone. And she could see tiny dark specks moving around it. The villagers. They were gathering. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a fresh wave of desperate energy. She had to hurry. The final part of the climb was the most dangerous. The path disappeared completely, and she had to navigate a steep field of broken, jumbled rocks, a place where a single misstep could send her tumbling into the abyss. Her body screamed in protest. Her muscles burned with a fiery pain. Her hands were numb with cold. Every breath was a struggle in the thin, high-altitude air. But she did not stop. She pushed herself onward, driven by the image of the gathering villagers below, by the knowledge that she was their only hope. She scrambled over boulders. She pulled herself up short, steep rock faces, her fingers raw and bleeding. She moved with a desperate animal grace, her body fueled by pure will. She was so focused on the climb, on the struggle for each new foot of height, that she almost did not see it. She pulled herself over the edge of a large, flat boulder, her body collapsing onto its surface in exhaustion. And when she lifted her head, she saw it. She was there. She had reached the summit. The peak of the mountain was not a sharp, pointed spire. It was a small, flat plateau, a circular space of bare, windswept rock. The wind here was a living thing, a constant, sighing presence that whipped at her cloak and pulled at her hair. The view was breathtaking. She was on the roof of the world. She could see the entire range of mountains, their snow-covered peaks glowing with the pink and orange light of the rising sun. And in the center of the plateau, just a few feet away from her, stood the spire stone. It was not as large as the great sunstone in the village, but it was far more ancient, far more powerful. It was a single, perfect crystal, its shape rough and natural, as if it had grown directly out of the mountain's heart. Its surface was not smooth and polished like the stones in the village. It was covered with centuries of lichen and weather stains. And its light, the light that was supposed to be the source for the entire valley, was almost completely gone. A deep, impenetrable darkness filled its core. It was not just a shadow, it was a void, a place where light had died. And then she saw the other thing. The thing that made her blood run cold. The darkness inside the stone was not still. It was moving. It was swirling, coiling and uncoiling like a vast, sleeping serpent. And as she watched, a part of that darkness seemed to leak out of the stone itself. It flowed like a thick, black smoke, pooling around the base of the crystal. The smoke coalesced, rising up into a formless, shifting shape that was darker than the rock. darker than the deepest shadow. It was a presence, a vast, silent, and sorrowful presence that seemed to suck the very warmth from the air. It was a grief shade. Kaia stared at it, frozen, not with fear, but with a profound and sorrowful awe. She was not looking at a monster. She was not looking at a curse. She was looking at the physical embodiment of pain. She could feel it. The shade radiated a sadness so deep, so ancient, that it was almost a physical force. It was the collected, unwept tears of generations. It was the sorrow of the long winter. It was the grief over her mother's death. It was her own grief, her own pain, standing before her, a silent, shadowy mirror to her own heart. She finally understood. Her mother had come here to comfort this. She had come to offer her warmth to this immense and ancient sorrow. And Kaia knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had to do the same. Chapter 6. The Grief Shade. The air on the summit was thin and sharp, each breath a sliver of ice in Kaia's lungs. The wind was a constant, mournful voice, a high, lonely sound that seemed to be the mountain's own sigh. Before her, the spire stone stood like a dark, forgotten monument. It was not a creation of men. It was a part of the mountain itself, a raw, untamed piece of the world's heart, pushed up through the rock over countless centuries. Its surfaces were not polished to a glassy sheen like the stones in the village. They were rough and uneven, covered in the patient artistry of time. Patches of gray and orange lichen clung to its sides, and ancient hairline cracks webbed its surface like the lines on an old woman's face. It was a stone that had seen everything. It had felt the first sun and the last snow of 1,000 years, and now it was dying. The darkness within it was a terrifying and beautiful thing to behold. It was not the simple absence of light. It was a living, breathing entity, a swirling vortex of deep purple and absolute black. It moved with a slow, hypnotic grace, like a storm cloud trapped in crystal. Kaia could feel its power, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the rock beneath her feet and in the very bones of her body. It was a power born not of anger or malice, but of an immense and overwhelming sadness. This was the source. This was the wound from which all the village's darkness was flowing. And then there was the shade. It was a being of pure sorrow, an overflow of the stone's immense pain. It had no definite shape. It was a column of shifting, coiling shadow, sometimes dense and dark as soot, sometimes thin and translucent like smoke. It had no eyes, no mouth, no limbs, but it was aware. Kaia could feel its awareness on her skin, a cold, static prickle. It was not looking at her in the way a person looks. It was sensing her, feeling her presence, her warmth, her life. It did not move toward her. It did not threaten her. It simply existed, a silent, towering testament to a grief that was too large to be contained, even by a heart of stone. For a long time, Kaia did not move. She simply stood and looked, allowing herself to truly see what was before her. She was not afraid. The terror she had felt on the climb, the fear of falling, the fear of failing, all of that was gone now. In the presence of this immense sorrow, her own small fears seemed insignificant. She felt a profound and surprising sense of pity, a deep and aching compassion for this shadowy, mournful being. It was not an enemy, it was a victim. It was a creature in pain, and its pain was a mirror of her own. She knew this grief. She had carried a piece of it in her own heart for 5 long years. She thought of Elder Boren and the villagers far below. She imagined them in the square, gathered around the dying great Sunstone, their faces filled with fear and anger. They were preparing to attack their own reflection. They were preparing to strike a blow against their own wounded heart. The thought filled her not with anger, but with a deep and weary sadness. They did not understand. They were trapped in their fear, and their fear was making them blind. Slowly, deliberately, Kaia shrugged the heavy bag from her shoulders and set it on the flat rock beside her. She moved with a calm and gentle purpose, her motions slow and respectful, as if she were in a sacred place. She was. This lonely summit was the heart of her world, the place where all the joy and all the sorrow of her people came to rest. She knelt on the cold stone, opened her bag, and took out her mother's things: the soft wool cloths, the small clay jar of soothing paste, and the worn, leather-bound journal. She laid them out before her, a small and simple offering. She looked from the tools to the grief shade. What was she supposed to do? Her mother's journal had told her to comfort the sorrow, not to fight it. But how do you comfort a being made of pure pain? How do you soothe a shadow? She had no plan. She had no ritual. All she had was a simple, desperate hope, a belief in her mother's wisdom. As she knelt there, her mind searching for an answer, the grief shade began to change. It seemed to notice her for the first time, not as a threat, but as a presence. The swirling, chaotic motion of its form began to slow. A part of the shadow detached itself from the main body and drifted toward her. It was a thin, dark tendril of smoke, moving with a hesitant, cautious curiosity. It stopped a few feet in front of her, wavering in the wind. And then it showed her something. An image appeared in her mind, as clear and vivid as a memory. It was not her memory. It was the stones. She saw Etheria as it had been centuries ago. The village was smaller, the houses rougher. The people were gaunt and thin, their faces etched with hardship. It was the long winter. She saw the failed crops, black and frozen in the fields. She saw the sickness, people shivering with fever under thin blankets. She saw the funerals, the small, sad processions, the tears that froze on the mourners' cheeks. She felt the immense, crushing weight of their despair, their fear that the spring would never come. And she saw how that collective sorrow had flowed up the mountain, a river of invisible tears, and had been absorbed by the spire stone. The first shadow had been born from this pain. The image faded, and another one took its place. She saw flashes of other sorrows from the village's long history. A child lost in a snowstorm. A fire that had destroyed 3 homes. A hunter who had never returned from the mountains. Each loss, each private heartbreak, each moment of communal grief had left its mark. A small, dark thread woven into the great tapestry of the stone's memory. The stone had been a silent keeper of their tears for generations, holding their pain so that they could go on living. Then, the images became more personal. The grief shade showed her things that were buried deep within her own heart. She saw her father, his face pale and still, his death from a sudden sickness when she was just a small girl. She felt the confusing, hollow ache of that loss, a sorrow her child's mind could not understand but had never forgotten. She saw the small, everyday sadnesses of her own life, the loneliness of the playground, the sting of a harsh word, the feeling of being different, of not quite belonging. The shade was showing her the history of her own heart, the small, forgotten wounds that had never truly healed. And finally, it showed her the memory that was the sharpest, the most painful of all. She saw her mother. She saw her mother on this very summit, her face filled with a determined love, her hands working gently on the surface of the spire stone. And then she saw her mother slip. She saw the brief, terrible moment of surprise in her eyes, the fall, the silence. The shade did not show her this to be cruel. It showed her this with a profound and shared sadness. It was showing her the wound that they both carried, the loss that connected them. Kaia knelt on the frozen rock, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with the force of these shared memories. She was not just seeing the sorrow, she was feeling it. It was a vast, crushing weight, the accumulated pain of 100 generations. It was a miracle the stone had been able to bear it for so long. She understood now, with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating. The grief shade was not a monster to be fought. It was a memory to be honored. It was a story that needed to be heard. She looked at the vast, shadowy being before her, and she was no longer seeing a curse or a blight. She was seeing the soul of her village in all its pain and all its beauty. She was seeing her own soul, and she knew what she had to do. The answer was not in a special technique. It was not in a magic word. It was in a simple human act. She had to share its burden. She had to let it know that it was not alone. She reached out a trembling hand, not toward the stone, but toward the wavering tendril of shadow that floated before her. Her fingers touched the cold, smoky form. There was no substance to it, just a profound and utter cold that seemed to drain the warmth from her very bones. But she did not pull back. She held her hand there, a bridge between her own warm, living heart and its vast, cold sorrow. And she began to speak. Her voice was quiet at first, a mere whisper against the constant sigh of the wind. She did not speak words of banishment or power. She spoke words of comfort. She spoke to the grief shade as she would speak to a lost and crying child. "I see you," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I see your pain. I am not afraid." She told it the stories of her own life. She told it about her father, about the small, happy memories she had of him lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see the whole valley. She spoke of the hollow place his death had left in her life. She told it about her own loneliness, about the feeling of being an outsider, about her quiet love for her work, for the feel of a stone growing warm and clean under her hands. And then she spoke of her mother. She told the shade everything. She shared her happiest memories, the smell of her mother's baking, the sound of her singing, the feeling of safety she felt when her mother hugged her. She spoke of her admiration for her mother's courage, for her strange and beautiful ideas. And then she spoke of her own grief. She spoke of the 5 years of silence, of the pain she had locked away inside her, of the anger she felt at being left alone. She spoke of the terrible, crushing weight of her loss. She was not just speaking to the shade, she was speaking to herself. She was giving voice to the sorrow she had never dared to express. She was opening the locked rooms of her own heart and letting the pain out into the cold, clear mountain air. As she spoke, the tears continued to flow, freezing on her cheeks. But they were no longer just tears of sadness. They were tears of release. Something incredible began to happen. The tendril of shadow she was touching seemed to grow less cold. It did not disappear, but it became less dense, more like a gentle mist than a column of black smoke. The main body of the grief shade, which had been swirling with a chaotic, tormented energy, began to grow still. It was listening. It was hearing her. It was feeling her compassion, her shared sorrow. Kaia knew she could not heal this immense wound by herself. The grief was too old, too deep. But she could offer it something. She could offer it a moment of connection, a moment of shared understanding. She could let it know that its long, lonely vigil was finally over. Someone had finally come, not to fight it, not to banish it, but to sit with it in its pain. She stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, her hand outstretched, her voice a low, steady murmur against the wind, sharing the story of her heart with the great, sad heart of the mountain. She did not know if it would be enough. She did not know if she was making any difference at all. But she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that this was the right thing to do. This was her mother's way. This was the way of healing. Chapter 7. A Polisher's Remembrance. Far below, in the cold gray light of the new day, the village of Etheria was a stage for a terrible play. The people were gathered in the main square, a silent, huddled mass of cloaked figures. Their faces, pale and drawn in the weak morning light, were all turned toward the center of the square, toward the dying great Sunstone. They did not speak to each other. They did not touch. They stood as individuals, united only by their shared fear and their desperate, fragile hope. The air was thick with a heavy, prayerful silence, a silence that felt more like a held breath than a moment of peace. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that clung to their clothes and seeped into their bones. The very air they breathed out was a testament to the encroaching winter in their world, each puff of white a small flag of surrender to the cold. In the center of the square, before the great dark stone, stood Elder Boren. He was no longer the stern but confident leader he had once been. He looked old and frail, his tall frame stooped as if under a great weight. He wore the ceremonial white robes of the elders, but they hung loosely on his thin body. His face was a mask of grim resolve, but his eyes, deep-set and shadowed, darted nervously from the stone to the sky, to the faces of his people. He was a man gambling with the last of his hope, and he knew the stakes were impossibly high. On a newly erected stone pedestal in front of him rested the sun shard. It was a beautiful and terrible object. It was a crystal, no larger than a man's head, but it was unlike any other stone in the village. It was perfectly clear, without a single flaw or inclusion, and it was cut with 1,000 sharp, precise facets. Even in the weak pre-dawn light, it seemed to gather all available light into itself, glittering with a cold, sharp fire. It was not a tool of warmth and comfort like the Sunstones. It was a weapon. It was a piece of crystallized light, hard and unforgiving. The moment arrived. The first true rays of the morning sun crested the high eastern peak of the mountains. The light was pure and white, the clean, unfiltered light of the high altitudes. It traveled across the valley, a golden wave that pushed the long, dark shadows of the mountains before it. It touched the rooftops of the village, and then it poured into the square, and it struck the sun shard. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The shard seemed to catch fire from within. It did not glow with a warm light. It blazed with a fierce, white intensity that was painful to look at. A low, powerful hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated deep in the chests of the villagers. And from the front of the shard, from a single perfectly pointed facet, a beam of pure, concentrated sunlight shot forth. It was a spear of light, impossibly bright, as thin as a man's arm, and perfectly straight. It crossed the few feet of space and struck the great sunstone directly in its dark, shadowy heart. For a single, silent moment, nothing happened. The beam of light simply rested on the stone's surface, a brilliant white circle on a field of dark gray. A collective sigh of hope began to ripple through the crowd. Perhaps it was working. Perhaps this pure, powerful light would simply dissolve the shadow, wash it away like water on dirt. And then the sound began. It was not a loud, explosive sound. It was a high, thin, keening sound, like metal grinding on stone. It was a sound of immense pressure, of something strong being forced to bend, to break. It grew in pitch and volume until it was a piercing scream that seemed to come from the stone itself. The great sunstone was crying out in agony. The villagers flinched back, their hands flying up to cover their ears. Their faces, which had been filled with hope a moment before, were now twisted in horror. This was not the sound of healing. This was the sound of torture. The brilliant white circle where the beam touched the stone began to splinter. A network of tiny, bright lines, like a spiderweb made of lightning, spread out from the point of impact. With a terrible, grating crack, a piece of the stone's outer surface, the size of a dinner plate, flaked away and fell to the ground, shattering into 1,000 dusty pieces. The shadow within the stone did not shrink or fade. It recoiled. It writhed like a living creature being burned, a storm of pure darkness thrashing in a cage of crystal. The stone was not being cleansed. It was being violated. It was being broken from the inside out. High above on the lonely summit, Kaia felt the blow as if it had struck her own body. A wave of sharp, agonizing pain shot through the rock beneath her, a violent tremor that shuddered up her legs and into her chest. The silent, sorrowful grief shade, which had been standing before her in a state of quiet contemplation, convulsed in agony. Its form, which had been a column of gentle, shifting mist, exploded outward in a chaotic burst of shadow. It lashed out like a wounded animal, a silent, screaming vortex of pain and fear. The spire stone itself seemed to groan, a deep, resonant sound of suffering that was more felt than heard. The connection was real. Her mother had been right. All the stones were one. The pain inflicted on the stone in the village was being felt in its full intensity by the heart stone on the peak. Kaia knew her time was up. There were no more moments for thought, for hesitation. The elders' violent ritual was destroying their world. She had to act now. She did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. She did not attempt to perform some grand magical act. She simply reached for her mother's tools. She took the softest, finest wool cloth. She opened the small clay jar of soothing paste. The paste was a pale, creamy color, and it smelled of mountain flowers and clean river mud. It was the scent of her mother's hands, the scent of a lifetime of gentle care. She scooped a small amount onto the cloth. She turned her attention away from the thrashing grief shade and looked at the spire stone. It was rough, ancient, and deeply wounded. She saw an area near the base that was slightly smoother than the rest, a small patch of stone that was cleaner, less covered in lichen. With a jolt, she realized this was where her mother had been working. This was her mother's unfinished work. With a deep, steadying breath, Kaia reached out and placed her hand on that spot. The stone was cold, a deep, lifeless cold that held the memory of the ritual's violent blow. But underneath the cold, she could feel a faint, deep vibration, a slow, weak pulse. It was the stone's heartbeat. It was faint, but it was still there. It was still alive. She began to polish. Her movements were not the rough, forceful scrubbing of the polishers in the square. Her motions were slow, circular, and incredibly gentle. It was a caress. It was a loving touch. She moved the cloth over the unfinished surface of the stone, her hand following the rhythm of her own breathing. It was an act of pure, focused remembrance. As her hand moved, she began to speak again. Her voice was no longer the hesitant whisper it had been before. It was a clear, steady murmur, a soft but unbreakable thread of sound against the wailing of the wind and the distant, agonizing scream of the stone below. She did not speak to the wind or to the sky. She spoke directly to the stone under her hand and to the wounded, terrified grief shade that swirled around it. She spoke of her mother. "She loved you," Kaia said, her voice soft and certain. "She told me you were the heart of the mountain. She said you listened to us. She was not afraid of you." She continued her gentle, circular polishing, her eyes focused on the small patch of stone, watching as the pale paste worked its way into the ancient cracks and fissures. She told the stone about her mother's hands, how they had been strong and capable, but always gentle. She described how her mother could tell the quality of a polishing sand just by rubbing a few grains between her fingers. She told it about the songs her mother used to hum while she worked, simple, tuneless melodies that were full of a quiet contentment. With each memory she shared, she made another slow, loving circle with the cloth. She was not just polishing the stone. She was pouring her mother's memory, her mother's love, directly into its wounded heart. I remember she brought me here once, Kaia continued, a small, sad smile touching her lips. I was very small. I was not supposed to come this high. She carried me on her back. She sat me down right here on this rock. She told me to be very quiet. She said if I was quiet enough, I could feel the whole mountain breathing. I sat here for a long time, and I did. I felt it. It was like the feeling of a big sleeping animal. It was you. You were breathing. The thrashing of the grief shade began to lessen. Its chaotic, explosive movements began to slow. The silent, screaming pain was being replaced by a deep, listening stillness. It was drawn to her voice, to the warmth of her memories. It was like a frightened animal being soothed by a familiar, gentle hand. Kaia then spoke of her own pain, her own anger. Her voice grew a little stronger, a little harder. The gentle circles of her polishing cloth became a little firmer, as if she were working a deep and stubborn stain out of the stone. I was angry at her, she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. I was so angry. Why did she have to come here alone? Why didn't she tell anyone? Why did she leave me? I needed her. The village needed her. It was not fair. She was so brave and so strong and so foolish. It was a foolish thing to do, to come here all by herself. She was no longer just speaking to the stone. She was speaking to her mother, to the memory that lived in this place. She was saying all the things she had never had the chance to say, all the things she had been too scared to even think for 5 long years. I missed you so much, she whispered, and now the tears began to fall. They were hot against her cold skin. They dripped from her chin onto the stone, mixing with the pale, herbal paste. Every day I missed you. The house was so quiet. The village was so gray. Nothing had any color anymore. I kept working on the stones because it was the only thing I had left of you. But I hated it. Every time I polished a stone, it reminded me that you were gone. Her gentle polishing was now an act of pure, honest grief. Her tears, her sorrow, her anger, her love, all of it was flowing from her heart, through her hand, and into the stone. She was not trying to banish the stone's sorrow. She was adding her own to it. She was showing it that it was not alone in its pain. She was sharing the burden. Far below, in the village square, the terrible high-pitched screaming of the great sunstone began to fade. The violent cracking sound subsided. The beam of pure white light from the sun shard was still focused on its heart, but the stone was no longer fighting it. A deep, resonant hum began to emanate from it, a sound of profound and weary endurance. The villagers, who had been cowering in terror, slowly lowered their hands from their ears. They stared at the stone, at the new, ugly crack in its surface, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Elder Boren's ritual had not worked. It had only caused more pain. High on the summit, Kaia felt the change. The violent shuddering in the rock beneath her ceased. The spire stone's faint, weak heartbeat grew a little stronger, a little steadier. The grief shade had stopped its frantic thrashing completely. It was now a tall, still column of shadow, its form no longer angry and chaotic, but quiet and attentive. It was drawn completely to the small, kneeling figure, to the gentle, rhythmic motion of her hand, to the sound of her soft, tear-filled voice. She had done it. She had reached it. Through her own honest pain, she had made a connection. She had begun to soothe the ancient sorrow. She continued her work, her tears flowing freely now, her voice a constant, gentle murmur. She polished the small, unfinished patch of the spire stone, her mother's last work, her own first true act of healing. She was not a warrior. She was not a hero. She was a polisher, and she was remembering. And in that simple, loving act, in the sharing of her own broken heart, she was performing a magic far more powerful than any beam of light, any ancient ritual. She was teaching the mountain how to heal itself. Chapter 8. The Warmest Light. Time ceased to have meaning on the high, lonely summit. There was only the endless, sighing voice of the wind, the cold, hard reality of the stone beneath her knees, and the steady, rhythmic motion of Kaia's hand. Her world had shrunk to this single, sacred act. The vast, panoramic view of the mountains, the drama unfolding in the village far below, the biting cold, the gnawing ache in her own body. All of it faded into a distant background hum. Her entire being was focused on the small patch of the spire stone under her cloth, on the flow of memory and sorrow from her heart into her hand. She was a channel, a bridge between the living world of feeling and the ancient, silent world of stone. Her tears had stopped, but the deep well of emotion inside her had not run dry. She had moved past her own personal grief, her own anger and loss. Now she was speaking for the village, for all the silent, forgotten sorrows that the stone had held for so long. She spoke of the young farmer whose wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with a newborn daughter and a heart full of a pain he could never share. She spoke of the old weaver who had lost her sight, who now sat in the darkness, her nimble fingers still remembering the feel of the threads she could no longer see. She spoke of the children's fears, of their nightmares of the encroaching darkness, of their simple, unspoken terror that the light might never come back. She gave voice to all of it, all the quiet, hidden pains that festered in the hearts of her people. She was not just polishing a stone, she was hearing the village's confession. She was offering its collective heart a moment of gentle, non-judgmental attention. As she worked and spoke, a profound transformation began to take place. It was not a sudden, dramatic event. It was a slow, quiet, and miraculous unfolding, like a flower opening its petals after a long, cold night. The grief shade, which had been a still and silent witness, began to dissolve. It was not a violent dispersal. It was a gentle release. The dense, dark smoke of its form grew thin and translucent. It began to unravel, the dark threads of its being loosening and separating. It was like a great, dark cloth being unpicked, thread by sorrowful thread. And as it dissolved, it did not vanish into nothingness. It flowed back toward the spire stone. It was a slow, steady river of shadow, pouring itself back into the heart from which it had been born. It was not being banished or destroyed. It was being reabsorbed. It was being accepted. The stone was taking its own sorrow back, no longer overflowing with a pain too great to bear, but integrating it, making it a part of itself once more. And as the last wisp of the grief shade sank into the stone, a new light was born. It did not come from the outside. It did not come from the sun, which was now climbing higher in the sky. It came from deep within the spire stone itself. It was not the sharp, brilliant white light of the sun shard. It was not even the bright golden light that the Sunstones had once possessed. This was a new kind of light, a light that no one in Etheria had seen for centuries. It was a soft, warm, and gentle light, the color of amber, of honey, of the last rays of a perfect autumn sunset. It was a light that did not seek to banish the darkness, but to hold it. It was a light that was full of a deep and compassionate wisdom, a light that had been born not in spite of the sorrow, but because of it. The darkness was still there, a deep, swirling core within the stone, but it was no longer a cold, dead void. It was a soft, deep shadow held within a warm and living heart. The stone was no longer just a vessel of light. It was a vessel of understanding. It was healed. It was whole. The light did not remain contained within the spire stone. As Kaia watched, her hand still resting on its now warm surface, the amber light began to flow downward. It pulsed, a slow, steady heartbeat of warmth, and then it poured into the rock of the mountain itself. She could see it, a network of glowing golden veins spreading out beneath the surface of the plateau, a river of warm light flowing down from the summit, following the invisible channels that connected the Heartstone to all the others. It was her mother's theory made real. The lifeblood of the mountain was flowing once more. Down in the village square, the people stood in stunned, horrified silence. The ritual of banishment was a catastrophic failure. The great Sunstone was horrifically wounded. A large, ugly crack now ran across its face, a permanent scar from the violent beam of light. Elderborn's weapon, the sun shard, continued to pour its harsh white fire into the stone, but it was having no effect. The shadow within was no longer thrashing in agony. It was simply inert, a dead, dark mass. The last thin rind of yellow light at the stone's edge had flickered and died. The heart of their village was dark. Elderborn stood before them, his face ashen, his body trembling. He had gambled everything, and he had lost. A low murmur of despair began to spread through the crowd. All was lost. The darkness had won. And then it happened. A single thin line of warm amber light appeared at the base of the great sunstone. It was so faint at first that people thought it was a trick of the eye, a reflection. But then another line appeared, and another. A web of golden light began to spread across the stone's dark surface, emerging from within, as if someone were drawing on it with a pen made of pure liquid warmth. The light flowed into the great ugly crack that the ritual had created, not healing it, but filling it, transforming the scar into a beautiful, glowing river of gold. The deep, dark shadow within the stone, the shadow they had feared and hated and tried to destroy, began to change. The warm, amber light seeped into it, not to fight it, but to mingle with it. The dead black mass began to soften, to lighten. It became a deep, warm violet, then a soft, dusky gray. The stone was no longer a battlefield between light and dark. It was a place of union, of balance. The stone began to glow. The light that poured from it now was the same soft, warm, amber light that had been born on the mountaintop. It was a light that felt like the warmth of a fireplace on a cold winter's night. It felt like the safety of a mother's embrace. It pushed back the biting cold, not with a harsh force, but with a gentle, persistent warmth that sank into the villagers' cloaks and onto their skin, chasing away the deep chill in their bones. It was a light that did not just illuminate, it comforted. The people in the square stared, their mouths agape, their hearts filled with a disbelieving awe. They had been prepared for a victory or a defeat. They had not been prepared for a miracle. The harsh white beam from the sun shard was still striking the stone, but it was useless now, a pale, insignificant thing against the stone's own powerful inner radiance. The ritual had been overwhelmed, rendered meaningless. With a final, sorrowful hum, the great sunstone absorbed the last of the angry beam, and the sun shard on its pedestal went dark, its power broken. The silence in the square was broken by a single, soft sound. A child, a little girl, who had been clinging to her mother's leg, let out a small, wondrous laugh. It was the first sound of pure, simple joy that had been heard in Etheria for weeks, and it was like a key turning in a lock. The tension in the crowd broke. People began to weep, not with sorrow, but with a profound and overwhelming relief. They turned to each other, not with suspicion, but with wonder. They touched each other's arms. They hugged. The long, cold winter in their hearts was over. They were a village again. High on the summit, Kaia felt the wave of warmth and relief from the village below as a gentle, pleasant hum in the stone beneath her. She slowly, tenderly removed her hand from the spire stone. The small patch she had been polishing was now perfectly smooth, and it glowed with a slightly brighter, more concentrated warmth than the rest of the stone. Her mother's work, and her own, was complete. She was tired. She was so deeply tired, a weariness that went to the very marrow of her bones. But she was also filled with a deep and quiet peace. She packed her mother's tools, her movements slow and deliberate. She wrapped the journal in its oilcloth and placed it carefully in her bag. She took one last look at the spire stone, now a beacon of warm amber light against the bright blue sky. It was no longer a place of sorrow and death. It was a place of life and healing. She gave it a small, grateful nod. Then she turned and began the long journey home. The descent was easier than the climb, but it was slow. Her body was exhausted, her muscles trembling with fatigue, but her spirit was light. As she made her way down the mountain, she could see the effects of the new light everywhere. The small sunstones set along the path, which had been dark and cold on her way up, were now glowing with the same warm amber light. The frozen black stalks of the night-blooming flowers seemed to be softening, a hint of green returning to their stems. The world was waking up around her. When she finally reached the edge of the village, the sun was high in the sky. The first person she saw was an old man sitting on a bench outside his home, his face turned up to the warm glow of the small sunstone above his door. He saw her, and his eyes widened. He slowly, shakily got to his feet. He did not say anything. He simply raised a hand and placed it over his heart, a gesture of profound respect. As she walked into the village proper, people began to emerge from their homes. They had seen her coming, a lone figure descending the high path. They came out into the streets, into the warm, comforting light, and they watched her approach. There was no cheering, there were no shouts. There was only a deep, respectful silence. They parted to let her pass, their faces filled with an emotion she could not quite read. It was awe. It was gratitude. It was a little bit of shame. She walked through the silent crowd, her gaze fixed on the center of the square. She saw the great sunstone, its beautiful, warm light filling the space, its golden crack a testament to the pain they had all endured and overcome. And she saw Elder Boren. He was standing by the stone, his white robes looking drab and foolish in the new light. He looked lost, a man whose entire world had been turned upside down. Kaia walked up to him and stopped. She looked him in the eye. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was no longer a grieving daughter. She was a woman who had faced the deepest sorrow of her people and had offered it comfort. She was a polisher who understood the true meaning of her craft. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say a single word of blame. She simply reached into her bag, took out the leather-bound journal, and held it out to him. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice clear and calm. "It is time we all learned to listen." Elder Boren looked at the journal, then at her face, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw her mother's courage in her eyes. He saw a wisdom that was far older and deeper than his own. His face crumpled. A single difficult tear traced a path through the weathered lines of his cheek. He reached out with a trembling hand and took the book. Kaia walked away, leaving him there with the story of their past and the key to their future. She walked through the village, through the warm, amber light that felt like a blessing. She was no longer an outcast. She was the heart of her village, the woman who had climbed the mountain and taught them that the warmest light is not the one that banishes the darkness, but the one that has the courage to hold it. Etheria was safe. Its light was no longer just a protection from the cold. It was now a true reflection of its soul, a light that was stronger and more beautiful for the shadows it contained. It was a light that was finally and truly whole. Hello and welcome. I am so glad you have found your way here to Sleep Tales. Tonight, we have a very special story for you, a story about light and shadows, about memory and healing. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let your body grow heavy and your mind become still. If you enjoy our journey together, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and commenting to let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. It is always a comfort to know where our stories are traveling. Now let your breath slow down. Close your eyes, and let us begin. The village of Etheria was a secret kept by the mountains. It rested in a high valley, a cup held in the stone hands of the peaks. Life here was simple and quiet, governed not by the sun and moon alone, but by the great Sunstones. These were not mere crystals. They were the heart of the village. The largest stood in the center of the main square, the Great Sunstone, taller than 2 men and wide enough for 10 children to link hands around. Many smaller stones were set along the pathways and above the doors of the stone and wood houses. During the day, they drank in the sunlight, absorbing its warmth and brightness. When dusk fell and the sky turned to deep purple and black, the stones would begin to release the light they had saved. It was not a harsh light, but a warm, golden glow that filled every corner of Etheria. This light kept the brutal mountain cold at bay. It helped the special night-blooming flowers to open their petals. It made the village a safe and peaceful place, a pocket of eternal gentle daylight held within the deep, dark night of the high mountains. In this village lived a young woman named Kaia. She was 21 years old, with quiet hands and eyes that held the deep gray of the mountain stone. She was a Sunstone Polisher, a job of great importance. It was her duty and the duty of the other polishers to care for the stones. Every day, they would clean and polish the surfaces of the great crystals using fine sands and soft cloths. This work kept the stones clear, allowing them to absorb the sun's light to their fullest. Kaia was good at her job. Her movements were precise and steady. She could work for hours, her mind focused only on the smooth surface beneath her hands, on the rhythmic motion of polishing. She was quiet and kept to herself, a solitary figure in a village of close families. Her quietness was a shield for a deep and constant pain. 5 years ago, her mother, Alara, had died. Alara had not just been a polisher. She had been the best, the most skilled and intuitive caretaker of the stones that Etheria had ever known. She understood them in a way no one else did. She used to say she could feel their moods, that she could hear them hum with contentment after a good polishing. Alara had died while tending to the Spire Stone, the highest and most remote of all the Sunstones, perched on a dangerous peak that watched over the village. The elders said she had slipped, a tragic accident on the treacherous path. For Kaia, the world had lost its warmth that day. She continued her work as a polisher because it was all she knew, and it connected her to her mother. But she never worked on the higher stones. She stayed in the safety of the village, her focus only on the familiar surfaces of the lower stones, her heart carefully guarded against the memory of the fall, the memory of the silence that followed. She polished away the dust from the stones, but she could never polish away the sorrow that had settled deep within her. And then a change began. It was subtle at first, a thing you might not notice if you were not paying attention. But Kaia noticed. She spent all her time with the stones, and she knew them. The golden light from the great sunstone in the village square seemed a little less golden. It had a thinner quality, a paleness at its edges, and deep within the stone, a place no polishing cloth could ever reach, a small shadow began to form. It was no bigger than a fist, a smudge of cold gray in the crystal's warm heart. It was a flaw, a stain, a tiny seed of darkness planted in the very center of Etheria's light. Kaia tried to ignore it, to tell herself it was a trick of the eye. But every day, when she placed her hands on the stone to begin her work, she could feel a faint, unfamiliar coldness spreading from that spot. The stone, which had always felt like a living, warm thing, now had a touch of winter in its core. Chapter 1. A Deepening Twilight. The change in the great sunstone did not remain a secret for long. What had started as a subtle paleness that only Kaia noticed soon became a topic of worried whispers throughout Etheria. The warm golden light that had bathed the village in a gentle glow for centuries was now noticeably weaker. It was a watery yellow light, like sunlight seen through a dusty window. The nights, once just as bright and safe as the day, grew colder. Families began to use more wood in their fireplaces, the scent of smoke hanging heavier in the mountain air. The weavers who worked at their looms in the evenings had to light precious candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows that made their small workshops feel strange and unfamiliar. Even the bakers noticed a difference. Their bread dough, which always rose perfectly in the steady, gentle warmth of the kitchens, was now sluggish and heavy. Everything in the village seemed to be slowing down, growing colder, succumbing to a strange and weary sadness. The deepest change was in the feeling of the village itself. The children, who used to play hide and seek among the glowing stones long after the sun had set, now hurried home at dusk. Their laughter, once the most common sound in the evenings, was replaced by a nervous quiet. They spoke of new shadows in the alleyways, shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. The glowing moss that grew along the edges of the main paths, a soft green carpet that drank in the sunstone's light, began to fade. Its gentle luminescence was now a dull, patchy glow, making the paths harder to see, more treacherous in the growing dimness. The night-blooming flowers, the pride of the village, were suffering the most. The sun petals, whose wide white blossoms would open each evening to face the great sunstone, now remained tightly shut, their heads bowed as if in mourning. The air, which usually carried their sweet fragrance through the night, was now just cold and empty. Etheria was losing its light, and with it, the village was losing its spirit. The village elders, seeing the growing fear among their people, decided they had to act. They called a meeting in the great hall, a large stone building whose walls were lined with small, embedded sunstones that now offered only the weakest of light. The hall was crowded. Every family was there, their faces filled with anxiety, their voices a low hum of worry. Elder Boren stood before them. He was a tall man with a stern face and hair as white as the winter snow. He believed in tradition, in the old ways. He saw the world in simple terms of right and wrong, of clean and unclean. He placed his hands on the stone lectern and waited for silence. He told the villagers that there was no need for fear. He said the stone was not sick or cursed. It was simply dirty. He explained that a long and dusty summer had left a film on the stone that was blocking its ability to absorb the sun. The shadow inside, he declared, was just that, a shadow. A trick of the light caused by the surface being unclean. His solution was simple and direct. The polishers had to work harder. They needed to double their efforts to scrub the stone with more force, to use the coarsest sands to remove this stubborn film. His voice was loud and confident, and the villagers, who were desperate for a simple answer, wanted to believe him. They nodded their heads and murmured their agreement. He was an elder. He was supposed to know these things.